2, 1, and you are live.
Welcome back, folks, to another great episode of Dr. J Radio Live. I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the City of Angels, or nowadays, I like to say City of Demons. I'll let you decide what it is. I've been saying this for a few years by now, but I truly starting to feel that it is more of the City of Demons. But hey, that's just my opinion, and it appears so that a lot of you feel like this. And we are internationally syndicated, starting with our home base, UPRN 107.7 FM, New Orleans, Louisiana, and all their affiliates, global affiliates, I mean from Hong Kong, Canada, and everything else in between. In EU, UK. And speaking of the UK, there is one network that did follow me from one network to another, ultimately to when I joined UPRN, which is Deprogrammed Radio, and they also have terrestrial affiliates in London, Leeds, and elsewhere. But their primary market is the UK in EU, so we are tapping all of the above. Now, if you've caught the title of what I put out for today's show, then you do know that this title is really doesn't say very much because there's so much more to our guest today. I'm hoping you folks literally have a moment to check out the bio, and even the bio, according to his own terms, is not really accurate because having that amazing conversation I did prior to this show really shows me what we're really in for today. Now, let's talk about what we're going to mention. Well, you know what? Let's just bypass that. Let me just go ahead and introduce our guest right now. He is the one and only Mr. Allen Greenfield. Allen, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Doctor. It's a pleasure to be here. It's doctor to doctor here, as the case may be.
Oh, well, hey, you know what? I'm going to start calling you Dr. Greenfield from now on, so we'll make it easier. Well,
that was an annoyance to my former Grandmaster in the Great Order of Antiquity that I have the pleasure of no longer being a part of.
Whoa, real quick, talk about that, the Order of Antiquity. When I think of antiquity, I'm thinking of Egyptologists or something like that. Am I thinking completely wrong? I mean, should I be thinking more of like OTO, Thelema, and things like that?
Well, some of these organizations are litigious, so I prefer to refer to them by the name that was given to them a century or so ago, and just refer to it as one of the great orders of antiquity. I always say that with a touch of irony, but if you've been around the occult, the UFO, etc. scene for as long as I have, there is bound to be a touch of cynicism involved in anything you have to say, particularly about organizations, because I have sort of soured on the notion of organizations and now consider myself, and have for the last dozen years, a free illuminist, which is a movement, not an organization or a corporation or anything resembling that, nor does it charge anything.
I actually told you beforehand that there was one thing I wanted to start with, and we'll go from there. But before I even get to that, Dr. Greenfield, let me ask you this. What is it about paranormal, about occultism, about ghosts, all of the above? What got you into it before we talk about the thing that I wanted to mention?
Oh, goodness. That was the one question I was afraid you were going to ask, because I have two stock answers on that, and I'll give you the one that isn't so stock. I have no idea. I mean, in 1952, when I was but a wee lad, July 1952, my folks took me to Miami every year in July. My father would come down for a week, leave my mother and I there for 2 weeks, and then come back for another week. So he'd get his 2-week vacation, visit his stores so he could knock something off of his expenses. And I remember him saying, "Wow, these flying saucers have been seen over the Pentagon." And at that age, 6 maybe, 5, no, preschool, so 4 maybe, I went, which translated into the English language is, wow, that's interesting. Although I would never have used those terms at that age. But why on earth did that strike my attention? It wasn't the Army McCarthy hearings or the Korean War. It was flying saucers over Washington, D.C. And then he got my mother and I to go see, because he had seen The Day the Earth Stood Still, original version, not the
new one with Keanu Reeves.
Yeah, the new one. Well, it's not new now, but the Keanu Reeves, much later version.
Yeah.
So I, was influenced by that. However, when Gort picked up Patricia Neal and carried her into the saucer, little Allen wanted to leave the theater, so my mother never got to see the rest of the movie. It's a shame. Something about Gort. Perhaps Dr. Freud would have something to say about that. His sort of phallic appearance, But anyway, suffice to say, it was too much for little Allen. However, a few years later, a little older, a little wiser, I joined the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, subscribed to the Mystic Arts Book Society, and the Science Fiction Book Club, all at the same time, 1960. It was a pubescent interest, but it has been there. All of those have been there ever since. So, from the very beginning, while it became a bit more sophisticated 10 years later, I have always seen those things as coming under the same general category, and that is that they seem to be related in some way that at that time I was not able to articulate, but with the emergence of many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, I decided, well, the best way to go would be to look at this in terms of interdimensional travel. After all, we don't see these things on Mars. We haven't been there, just mechanical versions of ourselves. But we do see them here. By here, I mean somewhere on, in, or just above the Earth. So perhaps, and also, interestingly enough, in certain key locations. Places that sensitives can immediately point out as places that have for lack of a realistic term, higher vibrations, places where ley lines intersect, certain caverns, certain mountains, and these stories have a way of melding. You get little beings that resemble leprechauns or space people. I don't know why space, but space people in the same mountain, 300 years apart. You get stories like the story of Ralph Lale at Brown Mountain, North Carolina, that resembles the story of the classical tale of the mine singer who goes into the Venusberg, a mountain in Germany, and loses track of time and is whisked away and finally gets out, which is a 1,000-year-old story, sort of updated in Wagner's opera, but nevertheless a very old and allegedly true story. You get the same things over and over, but the common denominator is something weird happens. A person or, interestingly, a group of people experience it, and they experience it in different ways according to their cultural context. And then it's not there anymore, and other people come in and they will analyze it according to their belief system. Some people will argue that Our Lady of Fatima was a religious experience, and some people will argue that it was, in fact, a UFO-type experience. I think they're both right and both wrong.
Now, I'm actually glad you mentioned that they're both right and they're both wrong. And real quick, going back to July of 1952, didn't that event occur twice over a span of a week?
Yes, it did. Actually, it was more than that. And it had huge implications at the time, given the context of the early 1950s and the earlier days of the Cold War, and that was during the Korean War. So I might not have been interested in what was going on in Korea, but certainly the government was. And there was a big secret that I discussed with Dewey Fournay, who at that time was the Pentagon monitor for the Air Force project, which we won't name because we don't want to publicize bad TV shows. But it was still Project Sign then anyway, I think, or Project Grudge. In any case, it caused the filter centers of all the ground observer corps in and around the D.C. area, and arguably around the country. All of the military planes in flight, many police vehicles, radar stations all over the country, but especially located in the nation's capital, to focus on what they took to be unidentified flying objects, although that term I don't believe had been coined at that point. They were still flying saucers.
Yeah. And it's actually changed now. Unidentified aerial phenomena. And a good friend of mine, a researcher by the name of Preston Dennett, says, how can you even call them flying when they're not really flying? If they're using gravity, then they're not flying the way we have traditional propulsion, pushing, burning some sort of chemicals, going back to China over 1,000 years ago to propel something forward. And I thought that was a very interesting point to make.
Yes, well, that's kind of the point. The nuts and bolts people, as I call them, and some other longtime researchers tend to call them, tend to say things that resemble our space program, and before that our advanced aeronautics program, and the German aeronautics program, and so forth and so on. In other words, they are interpreting it in terms of what they understand to be otherworldly flight as it would turn out. There was a book back then, a fictional science fiction book called The Gray Aliens, and guess what showed up just 10 years later under that name? The Gray Aliens. I don't think that book was particularly popular. In fact, I had to dig up a copy of that because it went one edition in paperback in Britain, I think, and then it was gone. I mean, you can find a picture of the cover if you Google it, but it's virtually unknown. So it wasn't influencing people. And yet that very term and those very type of beings began to manifest in the 1960s and have continued to do so all the way up until the present. Point being that it seems like the phenomena mold themselves to our expectations or belief systems or cultural values or whatever, and that they have done that throughout recorded history, and I would venture to say probably long before recorded history and shamanism and so forth, going back to the dawn of time. It may be that, as in Edwin Abbott's Flatland, which is readily available free of charge on the internet, that we are not equipped to actually resolve these phenomena in their full actual manifestation. So we resolve it with senses that the five senses that we have under ordinary circumstances, which are really built for fight or flight and reproduction and basically staying out of the mouth of a saber-toothed tiger and reproducing before we die. So there's that's not really the kind of equipment you would expect for something truly advanced. As Arthur Clarke put it, a truly advanced technology would be indistinguishable from magic, to which a magician like myself said, yep, that's certainly true. But my general feeling is that we don't really see what we think we're seeing. In terms of biological time, we just dropped out of the trees and stood upright a few seconds ago. In terms of geological time, not even that second has gone by. And in terms of cosmological time, we're not even a blip on the radar, so to speak. So the notion that we are equipped to deal with something that is otherworldly or transworldly or transcendental is, I think, a huge leap of faith. And faith is not the basis of my interest in this subject. In fact, I've always been fascinated by the first word that they came to indicate that one thought there was something to the phenomenon, and the word was belief. And that's a much abused term, but it's usually confined to religious phenomena. And even there, it's an abused term. It's based on faith and belief. Both date from the term fides, which means fidelity or loyalty, and not to the way that it's used in the sense of believing without proof. And yet that is the term that people will usually use in the shorthand. I've used to catch myself doing that, and I've stopped doing it. I certainly think there's a great deal to all of these phenomena, and I think they're all related. But I think it. I don't believe it. And my thoughts on the matter have changed over the years and are subject to further change.
Now I'm going to revert. You know, it's ironic we were talking about that. You said we just stepped off a tree and started walking. One of the people in chat is literally saying something similar, because we are not much more than upright, walking, talking monkeys with a narrow band of, I think he meant to say, it says interpolation. But I just thought it was ironic because while you were talking about in the glimpse of time, in that split second that we call history of this planet, and when you took it one step further, history of the cosmos, if you buy into the Big Bang, then what's a few thousand years? Absolutely nothing. Even a few million years, nothing in hindsight. Now, I'm going to revert back to the original question that I had meant to ask you before I got on this, which is something that not very many people have talked about. And the people that do talk about this, I love to speak to because their minds are very, very open. The people who want to separate ghosts, UFOs, occultism, Men in Black, Sasquatch, all of that, well, then I think they're doing a disservice to themselves and people who are researching. So, this is the question. What do you think the relation is between UFOs, ghosts, incarnation, to what I just said, Men in Black, Sasquatch, occultism, all of the above? All of these so-called unidentified or unsolved mysteries, whatever you want to call it.
Well, a large part of my conviction on that is based on the fact that if you reduce them to common denominator, all of the things that you have just mentioned, and you didn't mention cryptids, but we'll throw those in there.
Cryptozoology, that's right.
Yeah. They appear suddenly to one or several people. That would be a ghost, a UFO, cryptid, Men in Black, is, as the case may be, Slender Man, what is the new one, Shadow Man. Actually, my son did a film on that. But be that as it may, they all appear to a small group of people, occasionally to a large group of people. They cause a serious emotional response, which is usually not particularly positive, and then they disappear, sometimes right in front of the witness. That often happens with ghost or apparition type cases, but it happens with all of these phenomena. They're a glance, and then they're gone, and they leave a lasting impression. In turn, they usually have a profound effect on the percipient, as the late John Keel liked to refer to them. Their lives are changed by the phenomena, and they have a different view of their lives that, in turn, once again, is very similar to what is reported with people who experience near-death experiences. And if one has a near-death experience, it usually is very profound. There's great debate as to what causes them, but there's really no way to debate that it has a life-changing effect on the people who have participated in it. And there's a good deal of reputable scientific documentation that indicates that part of it. You can argue what the nature of the experience is. You can't argue that it changes the person because they will tell you so, and people in their lots will say, yeah, he went into this mean, insensitive person and came out of it a model citizen and patriot and all good things that men and women are subject to. That's got to be significant, that the phenomena that we ordinarily discuss as strange phenomena and something as supposedly of a different nature as near-death experiences, which comes from a totally different universe, so to speak, maybe literally, have all of these things in common. So there are two things that I want to stress. One is these points in common lead me to believe that they're the same thing manifesting for different people under differing circumstances, not necessarily as because of any intent on the part of whatever the source of that is, but having a lot to do with the fact that we're trying to still run away from those now extinct saber-toothed tigers and aren't well equipped to resolve these things with our limited senses. The other thing is, the reason these subjects are not more integrated is something I am intimately aware of. I can tell some anecdotes about it, but suffice to say this: ufologists are horrified by the notion that their field would be intermixed with, in general, there are exceptions to the rule, intermixed with, say, parapsychology or ghost lore or occultism, which they think is really bad. And yet I have talked to supposedly very advanced occultists, including the aforementioned Grand Master of one of the Great Orders of Antiquity, of which I was then a member, a high-level member at that, who was arguing to me that it would spoil my reputation if I published another UFO book. I had done one. It was very successful, from Illuminate Press, which there's a whole story about Illuminate, the life and death of Illuminate Press. But that was my first book, and I had a second one in mind, and this guy was driving me home from his then residence in one of the upper South states, and he proceeds to park and tell me basically, don't write any more UFO books. And I said, why? And he said, because they spoil your reputation. It has caused you a Grand Lodge position. And I thought, well, what am I doing in this club? Meanwhile, he's playing a demo tape with him jamming on it. He's a guitarist. Of Psychic TV and, in the background, while he's telling me that my reputation as an occultist is going to be spoiled by an interest in UFOs. And I thought, what's wrong with this picture? A great deal is wrong with the picture. Meanwhile, the fact is that if I don't know that you get a majority vote on the various phenomena, but I strongly suspect, based on some polling data, that the occult has a lot less academic and public acceptance, especially the organized occult, the deep occult that that gentleman and myself represented, than UFOs, which are widely accepted. You can see a lot of stuff on TV about UFOs, a lot of movies about UFOs, including from, the most major directors in the business and Oscar winners. The point being that he's wrong. He's clearly wrong. But he was my superior, so I said, are you telling me, as the Grand Master of the Order, not to publish any more UFO books? And he backed up a little bit. He said, no, I'm not telling you that. I'm just telling you that if you want to get ahead here, lose the UFO books. I can give you other stuff to write about that is right in line with and I started to think, I think this is the same thing that the little communist parties and Trotskyist parties and the other little tiny groups in the country that are political in nature do with their members, which is the high command tells you what to think, and then you are supposed to, whether you actually personally think it or not, you're supposed to parrot the party line, which is where that term comes from. And that's not my way. I mean, I'm an independent thinker, and I did not surrender my right to think when I got
Joined
into that organization.
I have a question that I mean to ask you exactly about what you're talking about, but we also have a listener question. So let me make mine really brief so we can get to the listener question here. Talking to people from the OTO, Church of Satan, Temple of Set, and other groups, they emphatically say there's no such thing as ghosts, no such thing as UFOs, nothing. Why do you think there's that reasoning? I mean, if they're going to have rituals and spells, which I know in many cases are symbolic, it's all what you believe and what you manifest via law of attraction. But why being so close-minded? If let me give you an example. If Peter Gilmore, and I'm not trying to knock anybody here, Peter, out there, if you're listening, if Peter says ghosts and UFOs and cryptozoology is all BS and don't believe it, it's not there. We only live for this life, so how can we have reincarnation? How could there be a ghost? Well, if we're not supposed to have the open mind about that, well, then how can we have an open mind about Church of Satan?
You're 100% correct, and the fact is, I'm not going to fall into your particular shticklock, as we say in Yiddish, but suffice to say, the hierarchical occult organizations, they, first of all, this is my 2-cent psychoanalysis. They make a great leap, especially the women involved, but all the people. They make a great leap by being for some form of occultism. That's a big thing in this society because it is an outcast thing.
Yes.
None of these groups have really large memberships. The only thing that I happen to know the size of the membership of the
OTO?
and I know the size of the membership, the declining size of the membership of the OTO, and I have a pretty good idea of the AA, and we can go through the whole list. The only one that has any kind of really large membership are the mail order outfits like Amor, which doesn't mean that they're, that they don't have legitimate information. It does mean that that's the easy way out. Whereas the reality of the situation is that they are out on a limb, or think that they are out on a limb simply by doing that one thing, and therefore they're afraid of looking at anything outside of that category, whichever category they're in. In other words, there are people who are Aleister Crowley buffs in the AA, the OTO, the various claimants to the OTO that have, some of which are past tense, some of which probably are more interesting than the one that has the corporate rights to the name, particularly Kenneth Grant's version, which I find more interesting than the Great Order of Antiquity that I was a part of. In any case, they know their subject. They can tell you chapter and verse, literally and metaphorically, what Aleister Crowley had to say about toilet paper, whatever the subject is. But you get them away from that, with a few exceptions. They don't know other subjects. They don't. I mentioned when I was 13 or 14, I got involved in, I mentioned a few of them, but I basically I read Fate magazine, therefore I knew about parapsychology, pop stuff at that time, but still, I knew about parapsychology, about cryptids, about UFOs, about ghosts, because I was interested in all of that. And apparently the readers of that magazine were interested in all or some of that, or they wouldn't be subscribers to it, and it was at that time a major player. And I joined the Mystic Arts Book Society, which did nothing but publish anything that wasn't nailed down by copyright on anything resembling occultism. They eventually got bought out by a porno company, but that's another story. Well, I'm not sure that's unrelated, but you would have to ask the late Mr. Crowley about whether that fits into the pattern or not. But and I joined the Science Fiction Book Club, started reading science fiction, fell in love with the works of Philip K. Dick, which I've read, I think, everything that he ever wrote. I think he was the great literary mind of the 20th century, which is saying a great deal, at least of the latter half of the 20th century, we'll say. I think I hope you and your listeners are getting that. I took an eclectic approach from the very beginning, because organizations tended to either be UFO clubs, or they tended to be occult organizations, or they tended to be ghost hunters, or they tended to be paranormal researchers in academia. Whatever, that was their thing, and it was their piece of the controversial. And they learned everything they could about their subject, but nothing whatever about these other subjects. And if they heard about it, I think they tended to think, oh no, that's less respectable, and we're striving towards respectability. Well, I don't give a damn, as Rhett Butler put it, about respectability. I'm interested in the truth.
That's right.
And the truth has to be much more eclectic than the hierarchical organizations are willing to be. So a dozen years ago, an unamiable departure from the great order of antiquity, and I was already on my way to being a free illuminist, which is not an organization, has no hierarchy, has no fees, has no oaths, and has a lot more members, so to speak, than, that is, adherents, as opposed to members, than any of these organizations individually, or I venture to say collectively. They are seekers after truth in mutual support of one another, not members of an organization where somebody at the top tells you what to be interested in and what not to be interested in. End of rant.
We have a couple of questions here. This is from Lars Saturn. And remember, there's another one after this. It says, what's his view on Jack Parsons?
He's very dead.
And I know there's a crater named after him on the moon.
Yeah, he was way ahead of his time in terms of rocket science. He was a bohemian. He was briefly a lodge master in the OTO, although at the time I think the OTO membership worldwide was like, and we're talking about that specific lineage of the OTO, was maybe 30, is my guess, maybe 50. That outside of Switzerland was the only active lodge at that time. But he became a heretic where OTO is concerned, and so he, had he not blown up, I suspect he would have probably formed his own organization. He wrote one of many, many, many fourth chapters of Crowley's Book of the Law. Itself a very interesting item in that it is, in effect, automatic writing, and from an unknown source, like many other trans-channeled writings before and since. Going back to, if I may, without stirring too much controversy, to the Book of Mormon, or Ahaspi, the Urania book, the Patience Work books, the Ra material, the Seth material, and the Mickey Mouse Club. If you follow what I'm saying, that they all have that same common denominator, and they're possibly have an affinity for the most ancient writings of what are called sacred texts. In fact, there's a place on the internet where you can find an eclectic group of things that are called, I think it's called sacredtext.com. And it's basically everything that isn't nailed down by copyright, which very little of it is anymore, because most of the copyrights on the really brilliant stuff was first half of the 20th century or the 19th century, and if they were ever copyrighted, it has expired.
Now, let's get to the next question. This comes from Lasha Senyak, and she's written a few things, so let me get to her actual question, which is two parts. If these things are all glimpses, now mind you, Dr. Greenfield, this was 15 minutes ago or 12 minutes ago. If these things are all glimpses of real reality, how can we study it? And the second part is, if we can only rely on the material, are we too limited in our thinking to truly understand this?
The latter may be true, and if so, then we will never fully solve the mysteries involved, but perhaps we can come to a better understanding than saying cryptids are this and UFOs are that. If you can say cryptids and UFOs and ghosts and the whole range are in fact different manifestations of the same underlying reality, perhaps we can at least have a better context to put these experiences in. The first question is more difficult. I would say that the thing that I have advocated for a very long time, mostly to people that just don't want to hear it. Some ufologists are okay with it. The occultists, it's basically talking to the walls. If they injected a scientific element into their work rather than simply making idle claims, and I'm talking about the organizations now, not individuals, although individuals might want to do this too. If they are well grounded in particularly physics, but maybe biophysics as well, theoretical physics especially, they probably can formulate some basic standards that would resemble a lot the work done for those since the period where J.B. Rhine was the sort of mover and shaker in parapsychology back in the 1930s. Come up with some standardized tests, some standardized ways of looking at these things, and looking at them from the perspective of what is the underlying meaning of this. I will give you one example of how that might operate. I had a long discussion, fruitless discussion, with the U.S. Grand Commander of the aforementioned Order of Limited Antiquity, that where I suggested, well, you know, we do these rituals and we do these conjurations, etc., etc. Why not deal with them in the same way that someone doing ESP tests does in terms of looking for objective results? Now, there will be a limitation on that because I'm not even sure that objective reality actually exists, but in the sense that the saber-toothed tiger really can eat you, it's not imaginary, then perhaps we can come up with a systematic way of dealing with all of these things in the same manner and doing statistical studies, doing evaluations. For example, if you're doing a healing ritual, they do work with under double-blind experiments with paranormal healing in parapsychology and come up with some very, very interesting results. Some negatives, but a lot that are well above chance values. I haven't lost you, have I?
No, of course not.
Okay, but they're not done. So I go into this whole thing about parapsychology and about how, while they have their flaws too, nevertheless, they are systematic, and they do look at things like chance versus something that statistically is suggestive that it's not chance. If I do ritual A and expect result B, and C doesn't deliver that result, or some portion of it, then the test is a useful failure. It says this isn't really doing what it says it will do. But if A, B, and C line up, then it's much more likely that what you say you're doing is what you're actually doing. And the response I got, I don't remember word for word, but it was something like, and no longer than, that's very interesting. And we moved on to the ritual of the evening.
Now, speaking, well, this isn't actually about rituals. This is just another, these people are very engaged, Dr. Greenfield. This is fantastic. Okay, this is from Hadley Scott McIntyre. When you say automatic writing, do you mean deciphered scribble?
No. It's readable, but it's written without the conscious knowledge of the, without conscious intent on the part of the person doing the writing. I do know that many of Crowley's supporters who are pretty much make the Book of the Law their New Eon Bible think of it in terms of being the message from a praeter-human intelligence, which it may well be, but nevertheless, usually you don't see the cover of the original, and on the cover, in Crowley's inimitable handwriting, is an observation made 2 years after the writing of the Book of the Law, the so-called Cairo working, that says, this is a great example of automatic writing. That's where it should have stood. That should be the, the written in stone version of what it is, because that is what it is. It may be a particularly important one. It may be a very useful one. But same thing is true of the raw material or stuff done with Ouija boards, which I understand Crowley was also doing with some later works. It seems like his followers are more convinced than he is. But I do think that there are genuine paranormal things going on with such things. However, I don't think they necessarily should not be subject to the same kind of higher critical evaluation that you have with, say, the Bible. I think that is very appropriate to understanding, and it isn't hostile to anything. It's simply trying to evaluate what is at hand in the same way you would evaluate anything from historical records. For example, it's written in King James English. Well, would a praeter-human intelligence use thee and thou? Somebody steeped in the King James Bible probably would, but probably interdimensional beings probably wouldn't. Are you following me?
Absolutely.
Thee and thou is all through the thing. So
now, back to the Book of the Law and the creature being Aiwass, or depending on who you ask, Lamb. I believe it's Aiwass. This comes from Lars Saturn. He says, what's his thoughts, meaning your thoughts, on Crowley and Aiwass, the being that gave him or dictated the Book of the Law? I believe it was 1904 or somewhere in that era, over 3 nights or 3 days in Cairo.
Well, the later story was April 8th, 9th, and 10th, 1904. By the way, a week after my father was born, which is interesting enough. But just to me, but interesting enough. I think that the note that Crowley made that I mentioned about the nature of the transmission, so to speak, is probably where you should leave that. I used to, they're pretty much gone now, but I used to be in close contact with a group in Kentucky called the Light Lines Group, headed by the late Carla Ruckert and an Eastern Airlines pilot named Don Elkins. And they channeled the raw material, which you may or may not be familiar with. Some of your listeners certainly are. which is very profound, but they made no pretense about the source of it. They told me to my face and in person and demonstrating it, anybody can learn to do this kind of channeling, and we don't know what or who Ra is. We only know the material has an internal validity, and we know how to channel it. I think that's probably the more appropriate and more scientific attitude towards these things, rather than a reverential attitude that because a being calls itself Ashtar Command, it really is Ashtar Command. That's a very, very ancient term, but in ancient times it was a demon, Asmodeus, and medieval times it was, in really ancient times it was a deity. In medieval times it was a demon to be invoked for certain demonic purposes at one's own risk, and has mutated into a being that shows up in UFO lore as this benevolent being that communicates with select people under the name Ashtar or Ashtar Command. Interestingly enough, as I pointed out in one of my books way back in the Wayback Machine, there is a medieval grimoire legend that the demon Asmodeus has the unique property that it claims that it is not a fallen angel, whatever that may be, but in fact is a certified good angel who transferred to America, and that's where most of the Ashtar or all of the Ashtar stuff comes from. So the modern Ashtar stuff. So Ashtar and Aiwass. I know this isn't time to plug my book, but I address that in my current book.
Real quick, before I get to the next listener question, can you tell us what the difference is between a grimoire and, say, a book or a writing teaching?
The term only applies, or has been applied only to really old books, mostly alleged to be ancient and are said by skeptics to be medieval forgeries, whatever a forgery that elaborate would be, that teach you how to do various kinds of magic. Invoke angels, evoke angels, invoke demons, evoke demons, and hopefully they also have exorcisms and banishings, because anybody who invokes those kind of powers and doesn't know how to banish them really well is on a fool's errand and a disastrous course. But they're basically old books of magic. Yes. Modern magic begins with the Golden Dawn, unquestionably.
Golden Dawn being the first thing that Crowley was involved in, right?
Yeah, but he was a latecomer to it, so you would say that it was a society of English gentlemen and gentlewomen that had maybe a couple hundred members, but most of them were people whose names you would recognize. William Butler Yeats, the poet, was a member. I think Bram Stoker was an early member. And
that I heard about Bram Stoker. What about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle? Because I know he was really into that.
Well, no, he was not a member, and in fact, he was up until World War I, which was well after the Golden Dawn had fallen by the wayside or fallen into various sectarian groups, among them Crowley's AA, the Arthur Edward Waite's sort of Christian version of the group, and then there was the sort of middle ground group, the Stella Matutina, which was Israel Regardie was a member of that, and I knew Dr. Regardie not as well as I would have liked to, because it was in the later part of his life, but he was a middle echelon member of one of the successor bodies, and so there are many successor bodies.
The OTO, was that one of them that spawned off the Golden Dawn?
No, not at all. It comes from an entirely different source. Basically, I would say, and this is my opinion, the OTO is a product of the fusion of two different groups of ideas. One is the Masonic Rite of Memphis and Mitzrayim, which Theodore Royce was the champion of and more or less the founder of. And the other was the Hermetic Brotherhood of Light, which teaches the inner secrets, so-called. I mean, they're not really that secret anymore, of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Light, and they fuse those two together so that the lower degrees, they're not that low. I mean, it goes from Minerval through 7th degree are basically Masonic in nature, and the ones from 7th through 9th are basically the teachings of the Hermetic Brotherhood of Light, which go back to P.B. Randolph. And since Crowley was, he had many good qualities, but he was a bigot, and P.B. Randolph was black. So Randolph sort of got uninvited to the dance and isn't in the, or at least when I left, it was not in the Litany of Saints. And in fact, he is basically, in terms of the West, the person who brought the secrets of tantric magic to the West, along with a few other people. But nevertheless, he was the prime mover and shaker and was a key player in the 19th century occult movement.
Here is an interesting question which would open up more of a path of extraterrestrials. Now this comes from, let me find the exact question here, because there's a lot of chat, which is great. People are definitely listening and throwing in their comments and questions. Okay, this comes from, let's find it here, Lars Saturn. Do you think the gray aliens are drones, or are they from another planet or another dimension? That's actually two questions.
Yeah. I think they're from another dimension, and I think they're drones. Another planet, as I said, if we see something on, let's say, Mars, or somehow interstellar travel has been mastered, and that would be possible from a planet going around Alpha Centauri, even within present technology, advanced a little bit, so it's not impossible. I don't see any reason. If we take a picture of one and it's on Alpha Centauri CB3 or some planet out there, then I'll say, oh, well, that's where it came from. But if it shows up at your door and acts in the way that John Keel used to describe them, they're more like the entities that I was mentioning that get conjured up, and they don't seem to be independent, and in that sense they're drones because they dissolve after a certain amount of time. Actually, mostly you don't see them dissolve. They leave, and then people will, go through a startling moment, and then they go to their door, and of course there's no car outside and there's no person outside because they've dissolved. I had an experience with that myself in I think it was Charleston, West Virginia, at the National UFO Conference in 1969. Great place to have a convention during the original Mothman period. But there was this guy dressed in black and looking.
Men in black.
Yeah, he was following us everywhere and keeping his distance. And I decided to confront him. And I must have weighed 350 pounds at the time. But anyway, I jumped out of my chair, which is some feat when you weigh 350 pounds, and ran after this guy. And he hurried out the door, and I had a camera in my hand. I was not because I was taking pictures for the convention, not and I was able to get ahead of him, and I blocked his way, and I took his picture unsolicited. That picture is out there somewhere. And he froze for the picture. And I said, "Who are you?" And he said, "I am a man in black in waiting." And then he darted off around a corner. This was on a Sunday, the last day of the convention. Okay, in Charleston, West Virginia, in the 1960s, on Sunday, the downtown streets, as my father used to say about a different place, you could have fired a cannonball and not hit anybody. There was nobody around. I went around the corner maybe 2 seconds after him, trying to pursue him. I didn't know what I was going to do. It's not like I had planned this out. He was gone. He was nowhere to be seen. And I looked at doorways to see if there was some place he could have gone in. There wasn't. And there was no traffic, and there was no car available. There was no car driving away, no squealing. He was out of my view for 2 seconds. I believe he vanished. And that's all I can say about it. I mean, it doesn't seem like these are real beings in the sense that they are autonomous and that they have a mind of their own. They are creations, and they come into being. I think the Tibetans call them tulpas, if I'm not mistaken. That's Eastern stuff is not really my forte, but they come into being for a particular purpose. They manifest for a while, and a short while actually, and then they have to go because they're about to dissolve, and they do.
Dr. Greenfield, before I get to the next question, you might know this. Dan Aykroyd actually saw Men in Black in New York. He even tells the whole story, how he was on the phone with Britney Spears about to do Saturday Night Live, I don't know, somewhere around 18 to 20 years ago, and he says that from where he was looking, the vantage point, that there was no way the car with these two gentlemen dressed in black with black hats could have turned around and just disappeared. He said literally in seconds or a second, they were here and then gone the next second. I just thought that was really interesting because he's one of the larger names of people that are household that actually says, hey, not only do I believe there are men in black, I saw some, and they disappeared in front of my eyes. I just thought that's fascinating. Let me get to the next question real quick, unless you want to comment on Dan Aykroyd. Did you ever hear his story?
Yeah, I'm aware that he is very interested in UFOs, and I had heard that story. It's perfectly credible because it sounds like mine. So I'm certainly not going to, say his story isn't true because mine is, and it sounds, like the same phenomena. But again, witnesses, I'm much more apt to believe is the wrong word. I'm much more apt to credit witnesses who are basically just ordinary folks who get these visitations, and I would say 90% of them, and that's a guess, never report them. They just never report them because they don't want to be laughed at or ridiculed or, have people writing on their doors or calling them up with, well, we kind of discussed that before the program.
Yes.
They'll call you up endlessly, and it's just, I can understand that. But the 10% that do report it are brave people, and I tend to credit their reports as being, as best they understand it, these visitations are real visitations by drones from other dimensions.
Very interesting. Let me, and you know what? This goes actually to what Bob Lazar always said, and the fact that if we are able to create gravitational waves, artificial gravity, then things like cloaking, invisibility, faster than light travel via wormholes, interdimensional travel, all of that becomes possible. So if, like you said, Alpha Centauri, which is so far away that nobody in our lifetime could even get there with any conventional machine we have on this planet. And also the idea, or not the idea, even if you see real credible images. As a matter of fact, Third Phase of Moon here is in the chat, the largest, most credible UFO YouTube channel, who I've had the pleasure of working with, is in the chat. They have lots of videos where you see the craft doing whatever they're doing and just blink out. And the best explanation is why they blink out is because they're going into another dimension and leaving this dimension. So I've always thought them to be from other dimensions as opposed to coming from another planet in a straight line. I mean, they have to be, I would think, using Einstein-Rosen bridges. Otherwise, they got to be millions of years old, at least. Anyhow, let me ask you this other question. Let me find it here because we got a lot more in the chat since then. Okay, this is also from Lars Saturn. What do you think about Crowley's unfinished ritual at that house on Loch Ness, which is the same house Jimmy Page once owned?
Well, the house wasn't fireproof, so I don't know. Maybe that's the completion of the ritual. I mean, it was Crowley considered it a place to be worshipped, and it was on Loch Ness, which is a fairly magical place. There's also a free Illuminous lodge on Loch Ness, but that is semi-coincidental. The house was not originally. It was bought by Crowley back when he had money.
Yeah.
And, I mean, that was, he eventually
early
sold it
1900s, right? Because I know he didn't have as much money in 47 when he was finishing his Thoth Tarot.
Well, no, that was early 1940s, actually, and it was, he described it, but it was painted by Lady Harris, and the paintings made it famous. The book is a gem, but I believe that's actually maybe the only one that's still under copyright because it was separately willed to the late Grady McMurtry.
But I do know it took 5 years for Lady Freda Harris to paint this, and maybe when I say 47, I'm thinking the time they died. And like you said, you're absolutely right. Just to clear this up for everybody out there, she did all the painting, and he just did the wording. And not to discredit someone for writing the wording or doing the wording on the tarot cards and even the initial 15 card spread that is suggested in the Thoth Tarot deck, but the paintings are marvelous. I really got to hand it off to her.
Yeah, the same was true half a century earlier with the so-called Weight deck or Rider pack, which was the first tarot deck that I ever got my hands on, because it was probably the only one in print at the time. In fact, I think I got it from the Mystic Arts Book Society, and I did my first reading in 1962 for my mother. So I'm very experienced with it, but that was the only deck available then, except for a black and white little deck put out by, I think, the Church of Light in California, which may still exist. I think it does. It's a spin-off of the...
It does. It does, yes. I've seen that, and I was given a gift of that. But between artwork, I've always been drawn towards the Thoth Tarot. And there's a lot with a lot of new images, and sure, they may change a few of the wordings. For instance, you may not have a king, some will call it knight or things like that, but regardless, it's for me, I think it's basically the same. Would you agree with that?
Well, I mean, there's some significant minor changes, like the Devil card, I believe, is called Lust in the Crowley deck. But what I was going to say is Pamela Coleman Smith drew the Golden Dawn deck, and not Arthur Edward Waite, who probably could not draw a stick man. So, the credit for ideas goes to Crowley. The credit for the splendid cards, which are standalone. I mean, I don't look at any book to read those cards. They speak for themselves. They are like any good painting. If you look at a meaningful painting, it speaks its own message, and sometimes that message is mysterious, and sometimes it's very explicit. And that is the way any well-drawn tarot deck will evoke, in the same way that a crystal ball can evoke. That's pretty much the only point I had to make there. It annoys me that women in magic seem to get far less credit than they deserve.
Even though they're equal contributors, and for a large period of time in United States history, it was women who were burned at the stake for being witches, even though they might have not been. Just the simple accusation. She's a witch. My dogs died, or my son got sick. Burn her to the stake. And Salem, I can't even, maybe you might know this. I don't know how many people or how many women were burned at the stake in that era, but enough for us to still be talking about it now.
Well, actually, they were hanged or even more grim things like pressed to death, which is, I'm not going to describe it, but in Europe they were burning witches with merrily away from the 1500s all the way into the 18th century. In Scotland, I think, was the last known burning. Burning at the stake is one of the most horrible ways. However, a good dozen or more were executed for witchcraft in Salem, and of course the legend is that is the beginning of witchcraft in America, because they are martyrs. Well, they may be. If you've ever read or seen the play Arthur Miller's The Crucible, they are martyrs to unscientific thinking, causing superstition, I guess you would say, and not their superstition, but the superstition of the Puritans that executed them. I don't think they were witches. They certainly were not devil worshippers. The idea just had not occurred to people, and the Puritans were willing to say that anybody who liked to dance was a work of the devil. So.
Now, I'm going to switch topics real quick, and by all means, if you want to come back to anything or take it to any directions, like I said, you're the guest of honor. I want to ask you about something that we talked about prior to coming on here. Mothman and the resurgence of new Mothman cases and new flying humanoids. First of all, can you briefly describe what Mothman is, and I'm just going to spill the beans of where, West Virginia, and involving a bridge, but I'll let you fill in that point before we get into the recent sightings.
Okay, well, anybody who's seen the movie The Mothman Prophecies, apart from the fact that the guy who sort of, it was Richard Gere, and John Keel looked nothing like Richard Gere, I'm sure he would have been happy to. There were two primary investigators on the scene. One was very local and a very good friend of mine, the late Gray Barker, and the other was John Keel. So most of what we know about those cases come from those two very, very different investigators. Gray was a folklorist, and he approached the entire matter from a folkloric standpoint. His book, The Silver Bridge, I think, is the definitive book on the cases there. John Keel was a journalist, and he approached it as a journalist. In fact, I think he went to West Virginia to investigate those cases right after he gave a speech to the local UFO club here, which I think my father paid for that. But so in a way, I had some small thing to do with his interest in Mothman, although he'd heard about it. We'd all heard about it. There were some UFO cases in West Virginia, and at the time these UFO cases took place, there were also, quote, other, unquote, phenomena, including what was described as a winged humanoid being with red glowing eyes. There are various opinions about it. All of this was in the vicinity of a bridge between Ohio and West Virginia, the Silver Bridge, which had been there for a long time. And it was a big bridge. Some of the witnesses to the UFO cases seem to be suggesting that there was a connection, no surprise to me, between the UFOs and the Mothman appearances. This was in the 1966-67 period, And West Virginia is very rich in cryptids and folkloric things anyway, and UFO cases for that matter. So it was a heavy concentration around the Silver Bridge, and then at a really tragic situation, the bridge collapsed, giving rise, with a lot of people on it, a lot of people were killed, a lot of people...
30-some, right, were killed?
Yeah, it was the number 37, 38. I would have to look it up, but it was a disaster, and it's called the Silver Bridge disaster. And some of the books that are written about it focus on it being a bridge disaster. Other people say the Mothman, or Mothman, as the case may be. I don't think they ever saw more than one at a time, so it could be one, could be more than one. There were also Men in Black cases in that same area at the same time. Now, one either thinks that these are totally separate phenomena, or one thinks they are all manifestations of the same underlying thing. I think the latter. And some people think that it was a harbinger of the bridge collapsing. I was neutral on that until many years later, because the cases gradually subsided and then, as is their wont, disappeared, leaving behind two excellent books on the subject and an annual festival, because Mothman became, in a manner of speaking, a local celebrity. There's actually a statue of Mothman in
West Virginia.
The little town. You should go sometime with your microphone.
Absolutely.
It would be. It's sort of the successor to the Roswell Convention and the great original giant rock conventions in California, which George Van Tassel put on for many years with considerable success, and that foreshadowed the entire New Age movement, actually. But be that as it may, and for better or worse, there was a long period thereafter where you didn't see that particular type of cryptid again. I hit on a case of not particularly great importance. A man and his son in St. Paul, Minnesota, spotted a cryptid, flying cryptid, that when they didn't use the term Mothman, but the description matched the descriptions given many years earlier in the Mothman cases in West Virginia. Not a hugely exciting case, but the next 2 days later, I think it was the I-35 bridge collapse with a number of deaths involved there, and I thought, well, maybe they do show up at bridge collapses, and maybe they are harbingers of ill. Then, much more recently, if you saw the movie, and I've seen it like 30 times, I think it's probably the best. So do I. HD at that, but and I saw it originally in a theater with a girlfriend at the time. But be that as it may, it was actually a very splendid movie, because not so much just the plot, but because it captures the mood of getting involved with these experiences, including, of course, the notorious Indrid Cold case, where a UFO is seen, it comes down, a being comes out of it, approaches this man's car, and scares the bejesus out of him, and says some things that are consistent with a lot of other so-called silent contactee cases, which he said, "My name is Indrid Cold, and I come from a country much weaker than your own, so you have nothing to fear." And then he concluded his little monologue with, "I'll see you in time," which shows up in a lot of cases, too. And Keel made much of that, as if these were beings that did not see time in the same way that people see time. I covered all that in my first book from Illuminate Press, which is back in print, actually. So.
Well, when we get to 25 minutes from now, I'm going to give you all the time to plug in where people can find them, and again, recite the titles of all your books and all your works, and where people can find you. Sticking with Mothman, if you recall right before we came on air, and Third Phase of Moon, if they're still here, if they're still in chat or at least listening, they know about this flying humanoid that I want to say Fausto Perez either captured it, or Jim Martin or John Castro. Those are the three disciples of Robert Bingham, the man who says he could summon UFOs at will. The question is still up for debate. Was I a believer when I first showed up that first day? I was an absolute skeptic. After I'd seen something with my own eyes with a group of people and I filmed it and it made its way to Third Phase of Moon, well then yes, I was a believer. But then over time I started to think, well, I don't know if Robert still has the powers or if he ever did because of the balloons. But if you recall what I said, Jaime Maussan was so interested in that flying humanoid, which looked like the legs proportionally were so much longer than the arms and the torso. It almost looked like 3 times at least the size of the torso were the legs. And so my question to you is, where else around the world have you seen or heard about flying humanoids? And if this is the first time they've popped out, the new Mothman cases, and I'm not trying to clump the two together unless you say they are related, why such a big gap in history? Or was it that they were just around at other places where other bridges collapsed or other things were going on and people just didn't report it? Or is it genuinely that they literally disappeared and didn't come back till now?
Well, yeah, there were cases in other parts of the world. They're not as well documented. In Latin America, there were a lot of cases, and they didn't involve bridge collapses, but they did involve an earthquake here. UFOs are seen around earthquakes all the time. That's not unusual, and there's even a physical explanation for that, which I don't necessarily buy into, but there is one. Has something to do with electromagnetism and plasmas and stuff like that I tend to rate as less than important. It may explain a few cases. It is not an explanation. It's like the late Philip Glass's plasma theory that by explaining things, he explained pretty much nothing, because, plasmas are as theoretical as spaceships and, or I should say other people's spaceships. The cases that I have good documentation on are all American cases, and I think that's because I deal with a lot of fellow occultists in Latin America. We have a big free illuminist presence in Latin America, thousands of people. They tend to be more formal than I am, but they're good folks. They are entirely separate from the ufologists in Latin America who focused on how shall I put it, classical UFO cases. And frankly, if there's a cryptid case, which theoretically is what you would say the Mothman cases are in the broader sense, they don't investigate those. So I have very limited information. A cryptid was seen that had wings, that in Chile, that had wings, that appears from the brief descriptions that I've been able to get to be identical to the Mothman phenomena, particularly the more recent cases. Most of the ones in West Virginia were at night, so they were not seen flying well above the situation. The recent ones in Chicago, and then the much more recent ones, I would even say current ones in Indiana, are they're seen flying. And the case in Latin America seems to be of that sort. And in that particular instance, there was a major earthquake, which probably is the more memorable part of it because I believe a lot of people were killed. A lot of people were killed. And there are cases from Asia. None from Europe that I know of, but my guess is that's just because I don't know of them. I don't, there are, every now and then there's an article in a newspaper, why are there no UFO sightings anymore? And I have to, giggle at that. Well, I'm not a giggler, but I do laugh at it because there are UFO reports every day somewhere in the world. I mean, I predict there will be a UFO report tomorrow. It doesn't take any psychic phenomena or summoning or anything else. There's more than one every day somewhere in the world, and
I could attest to that. I could guarantee. I know for a fact, Dr. Greenfield, because Third Phase of Moon, literally, people send the Cousins Brothers footage on a daily basis, and not just one piece of footage, multiple pieces of footage. And if the footage is just a tiny light in the dark sky that has no reference points, then they generally don't release it. But if it's something more compelling, they release it. For them to have thousands of videos that were given to them by people who don't go out searching for them. I mean, they're people who, say, for instance, on YouTube, they have a channel based on their puppy, right? And all of a sudden, one pops up, UFO over my house. That's when you know that person is not someone who's into the paranormal and just happened to capture something paranormal. So like you said, you predict something that happen tomorrow. I'm sure from the time we speak till tomorrow, 24 hours from now, there won't be just one. There'll be probably more, especially considering you can't really go anywhere on Earth anymore without being filmed. I mean, you really have to be hidden in public to not be filmed. I mean, look at England, CCTV. Everyone's got a phone in their pocket with the camera on it these days. So with that, take all together, well, I'm pretty darn sure things are happening all the time. And then there's that theory that every time there's clouds, that above the clouds there's more UFO activity. Why? Because that's a perfect time for them to do whatever they need to do. And as a skydiver, I could tell you many of these clouds are not very high. I've jumped out of a plane above the clouds, had a few seconds of free fall before I went through the clouds, and then you're underneath them. And when you're above the clouds, it looks like the whole world till infinity is just a cloud, a layer of clouds. So to say that there's ET craft or even U.S. intelligence testing new technologies above the clouds, I think is very plausible.
Oh, well, I think that some clouds are actually produced by the appearance from other dimensions. I use the word dimensions very hesitantly. It's not exactly what... Actually, the proper term is brains, but not as in B-R-A-I-N-S, but B-R-A-N-E-S. And the version of string theory that's called the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics and other variants of the same thing, these brains happen, they came into being at the same time as the Big Bang. Begs the question, well, what was the Big Bang, and was it an event or was it a multiple event in multiple places? We really don't know. We know far less about the universe than we'd like to think. But the many worlds interpretation does satisfy a lot of the mysteries that exist in conventional classical, if you call anything in quantum physics classical, and these things seem to appear out of clouds, out of caves,
yes.
out of leading to the notion, that there are underground bases. I'm not so sure they're underground. I think that it may be that there is a portal that is formed that makes it appear they come from underground or over the clouds or whatever. A certain number of cases do come from people flying at 20,000 feet or 30 or 40,000 feet, so that mostly from pilots. People don't look out the window of commercial aircraft very much. unless the pilot says, "Look, ladies and gentlemen, that is Las Vegas, Nevada, right down
That's
below."
right. Or the Northern Lights, Aurora Borealis. Take a look
Yeah.
at the left side. You just mentioned portals, Dr. Greenfield. Let me ask you this because a couple people have commented on them. When we were talking about Mothman, how there's a new Mothman cases, yet for decades we didn't hear much about it. What's your take on so-called jump rooms? I'm assuming that's artificial stargates versus actual portals. Do you believe they exist, which you just mentioned? And if so, do you know of any possible locations where there are portals that will lead us to another dimension, galaxy, planet, anything?
Well, I think they lead to other dimensions, and other dimensions are space and time are different in them. So that the notion, if you go into another dimension, it will provide transportation to another planet in a galaxy far, far away, to borrow a term. Maybe yes, maybe no, but they're definitely different. The whole concept of space-time is entirely different, if there is any space-time. There are probably worlds that are almost identical to our own. We may even meet our double. That has happened to a lot of people. Doppelganger is the common term for that. Or there are some that are probably so radically different from our world that, or our consensus reality is a better term, actually, that we probably would be very, very, very freaked out by it. People, I don't encourage anybody to do psychedelic drugs. It's not my deal, and I have seen too many cases of people who have, let's say, become impaired thereby. But supposedly the whole thing about the spirit molecule is seeing into some of these more bizarre worlds, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if that were true. But I think that's probably an uncontrolled experiment. When you jump out of a plane, you do have a parachute.
Yes, two.
If you don't, you have a one-way trip that is no doubt going to be very, very religious experience, but you're not going to tell anybody about it unless you're one of the luckiest people on the face of the earth.
Really lucky. I've only known 2 people who have jumped without a parachute that lived. One landed in a gigantic net that was held by several people. Another one went through a warehouse roof into approximately 20 feet of styrofoam blocks with, I believe, each side of these squares was a few feet. So if it wasn't for those cushions, like you said, spirituality would definitely come in hand. Other people, knock on wood, because I have lost a few friends jumping. I don't need, because see, I know what it feels like to be in free fall. And as opposed to someone who's never jumped before, who's going to tumble in all sorts of directions. And because I know what it's like to be in free fall, I don't want to picture the ground coming up with no parachute opening, because I will literally be conscious and aware till the second I hit the ground. And knock on wood, I don't want to mock, especially these friends of mine who have passed away. A lot of people bounce, and I mean literally bounce. Their body will hit the ground like a thud, and then they'll, bounce up a couple feet. And I'm not talking about landing on rubber, concrete. Usually is the main thing, but it's a very, very sad phenomenon. But yeah, like you mentioned, it is definitely a spiritual situation at that point for those people. Now, let me ask you this, so I could get.
I never answered your question about portals.
By all means, go ahead and finish it before we go on.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I don't want to run out the clock on this, but there is a species of magic called Enochian Magic. If you had Lon Duquette on, I'm sure you're aware of that, because he's written extensively about that, and it is a subject which he knows, and so do I. Enochian workings of a certain variety really are essentially creating a portal to other I almost said spheres of influence, other dimensional places, but they're specific places. That's one of the beauties of magical ritual when it's properly done, which is there's an opening where you open the portal, not for yourself, but for a scryer, and they enter a known dimensional vortex, and they see whatever they see, which is usually the same thing that everybody else sees, which is pretty good validation, especially if you only have scryers that have no previous experience with the subject. And then you bring them back, and then you close the portal. And if you don't close the portal, the person that asked about Jack Parsons didn't close the portal, and some people say UFOs all have come out of the portal that he opened in 1946 and never closed. I don't necessarily credit that, but it's an interesting idea. That would be in Pasadena somewhere.
Very good point. I've never heard that, Dr. Greenfield. I do know he was fond of opening and closing them. I do know, like you said, in Pasadena, he had this giant mansion where, as a matter of fact, JPL wouldn't exist today, or wouldn't have started to exist around the time that he started playing around with jet fuel and these chemicals, but I've never actually heard that. I've heard several people talk about opening a portal and never closing it, thus allowing ETs, UFOs, Sasquatch, and spirits to come through. But for Parsons, I think this is fascinating.
Mm-hmm. It was the Black Pilgrimage, so-called, that there is no record of, to my knowledge, of a closing of that major portal, and it is indeed right before UFOs show up. It's in fact months before. But if you assume that UFOs are a modern phenomena, which I think they're not, but if you date it from the Kenneth Arnold case in 1947, then the working that I'm speaking of, that Parsons opened a portal and something came through. That's not my statement. That's an observation. I don't even remember who wrote it. I think the guy that wrote Sex and Rockets came up with that. But about Parsons and his various interests. I think it's a well-named book. But basically, the idea is he opened it and something came through. And if he didn't close it, it continues to come through. Cryptids and UFOs and whatever phenomena there are that are available through that portal. It's not a natural portal. There are natural portals. It's an unnatural portal, and
artificial. Man-made.
It's constructed magically, and was constructed with sexual magic, which is one of the more powerful, I would say second only to blood magic, which I don't encourage at all. It does major things, but you'd best be conscientious, if you have any ethics at all, about, I'll put it this way, when I teach someone magic, I teach them to banish or to exorcise long before I teach them how to invoke. Simply because I believe that that's a necessity, because it's a lot easier to open one than it is to close it. Anyway, the Enochian workings, working with the 30 ethers, in fact, is going to 30 different universes, and it's very impressive, especially if you do it in a sort of scientific way, which I have done, which is with a room full of people who don't know diddly squat about Enochian magic, and then asking them about their experience after the session, and then reading to them a classical account of similar experiences, and the closeness is always there, along with phenomena that seem to happen in the room. It's sort of like seance room phenomena, and maybe actually, I'm not a big believer in mediumship, but maybe is a related phenomena. That is, one time we opened a particular ether, and the room was heavily tiled, as they say in Freemasonry. There were two doors. They were both locked, and I was standing in front of one of them. I had done the invocation and then stepped back, stood in front of the locked door. The other door was my lodge Tyler. That was during my period as the lodge master, and he was standing in front of the other door. And while we have drifted in other directions over the years, nevertheless, totally honest person who would never, fudge. A number of the people in the room, significantly not all, saw a shadowy figure, resembling a man in black, really, wandering around outside our circle of initiates while the scrying was going on, and then disappearing when we turned the lights back on. So, stuff happens, and it's all pretty bizarre, to use my friend Tim Beckley's term.
Yeah, hey, Tim Beckley is a great guy. He's not just a publicist, publishing a variety of great books from great authors like Tim Schwartz. He himself is a great author and a fantastic guest. I'm glad we have another person in common. This is great. We have a few minutes left before I'm going to turn the tables to you to plug stuff in. So let me take advantage of this. Ghosts. You yourself, Dr. Greenfield, have seen some ghosts. Can you tell us about, I believe you said 3 times?
Let's see. I'm not sure.
Cats was one of them.
None of these are real recent. The cat. Okay, the cat. I used to live in a little town called Ackworth, Georgia. I used to joke with people that if they go one exit too far on the interstate, they will fall off the edge of the earth. That's how far out of Atlanta. And Atlanta is a huge, sprawling city. I don't know if you've ever been here, but it's how you define Atlanta depends on, it's arbitrary. So whether Ackworth is part of Atlanta or is a rural community far out in the country. Anyway, I took walks, and I mostly took walks at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, primarily because I'm a night person, and in Ackworth, I really did not want to deal with the truck going by with the Confederate flag and the Yahoo throwing water bags, the usual stuff. All I had to deal with in the middle of the night were the cops, who were always suspicious of somebody who was committing the sin of taking a walk at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I say, well, I live here. I'm old. I don't live here. And the crooks who are out there, and I had to face down a couple of guys with guns once, and I said, give me all the money, and I hoodooed them. So they saw an empty wallet, and it wasn't empty. I rarely carry money. It was, I don't know whether they saw me draw the money out or not. It doesn't matter. They went on their way, and I went on mine, and I told them that I wouldn't tell the cops because they were young black guys, and in Ackworth, that would be a guarantee that
Life.
young black guys with hoods on would be arrested and sent to prison for the next 20 years. So I left it alone, and anyway, I walk year-round. Now I ride my bike year-round, and I do it much earlier because I'm older now. But I ride about 8 o'clock at night for half an hour. Anyway, actually that's daytime in the summer. But this was really late at night, and every night I went, when I got very close to home, I went through this alley, which was behind a commercial building, and there was a paper bag sitting in the middle of the road of the parking lot that I was walking through, and I must have passed it like easily 2 months in a row. Okay, and every time I saw it, my initial thought was, there's a cat on that bag. And whenever I would approach the bag, and I never had it out of view, but I was seeing it the way we resolve things at a distance, like seeing the pyramid on Mars or the man in the moon. If you see something at a distance, your brain will tend to try to organize it, whether there's something there or not. And there's no man in the moon. I don't know whether there's a pyramid on Mars, and I'm sure we will find out eventually. But so I had passed it. I did this every night. It wasn't raining. Sometimes when it rained, if I had an umbrella, Maybe 60, 70 times, and it was always, when I got close to it, it was just a plastic bag. Nothing running away from it, nothing whatever. One night, I saw the cat sitting on the bag, and I thought, oh, well, there it goes. Here we go again. I got up close to it, and there was a cat on the bag, sitting on the same bag in the same place that I had seen an imaginary cat before. I got very, very close to this creature, making sure that I wasn't mistaken, and it was there. And then it was gone. Poof,
what color was it?
Gone.
Black?
No, it was white.
Interesting.
And that neighborhood is full of feral black cats, so the white cat was very unusual. I mean, whole generations, the 10 years I lived out there, the whole generations of black cats lived in the storm drains, and I guess they lived on the wildlife because, like I said, Ackworth is the end of the world, so wildlife does wander in there, so they were well fed. But this was totally, I never saw it before, never saw it again. Paper bag was still there the next day, which I suppose they never cleaned up their driveway. But for months, I had imagined that cat, a white cat on a brown bag. And then there was a white cat on a brown bag that disappeared. Now, there was no one else there. Could it have been a hallucination? Possibly, but I'm not prone to hallucinations, so I don't think that that's very likely. Is that some kind of major event? No, but I would call it a ghost sighting. Also, it reminds me of that little thing in the Matrix where the warning that the Matrix is falling apart was a cat that kept doing the same repetitious behavior over and over, and it put me in mind of that. But it's just a little thing. If you want to hear the other two times,
yeah, absolutely. Before we run out of time, absolutely, I'd love to hear them. And
okay,
so would
I'll
they.
do it. Maybe, we'll see. The first one was about 1964, and it can probably be dated exactly because the premiere of a TV program called The Stately Ghosts of England was on, which featured some film footage of an actual ghost. Now, I was watching at a time when my parents were safely put to bed. I am an only child, so there was no one else in the house. And I'm pretty sure that watching the program, because I was already well into the period where I was interested in these sort of things, I was watching the program, and it came to the scene where they accidentally got this footage of a ghost. And suddenly I hear from the directly adjacent kitchen this loud, banshee-like moaning. It was inside the house. My parents were asleep. And I was petrified. I was absolutely petrified. It was a loud type moan. And I, being the brave researcher that I am, I ran towards the steps to talk to my daddy, muttering every prayer that I knew, including some from other spiritual persuasions than my own. And then I thought, this is ridiculous, and I really want to see this program. It was probably, and I must have come up with some sort of rationale. Did I imagine it or whatever? So I go back in, and my heart is really beating, so I am as alert as a human being can be at this point. I want to watch the program. Oh, by the way, I did look in the room. Nothing, nothing to indicate that there was anybody there or someone had snuck in or anything of that sort. Nothing of that sort. I sit back down, but I am as alert as I could possibly be, start watching the program, and it happens a second time. Well, I know a little bit about the kind of hallucinations that people have upon awakening or while they're drifting off to sleep, and there's some reason to debate whether they are totally hallucinatory or whether they are, in fact, the externalization of a very real world that we really know about at some level of consciousness. But I was as wide awake as it was possible to be the second time, and it was exactly the same sound for the second and last time. I lived in that house for 13 years. Never happened before, never happened again. Your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah, that would actually scare the crap out of me. Go on.
Well, it didn't literally do that, but it came close. And then finally, I was on a legitimate ghost hunt. I had seen some articles about a cemetery on St. Simon's Island, Georgia, that was famous for its ghost of a 19th century woman in the graveyard of Christ Church, which was then described as an Anglican church, which is an anomaly in America. It's now gotten into conformity and calls itself an Episcopalian church. But small church, famous because in the early 1700s, the Wesley brothers, who later invented the Methodist Church, were the, I guess, priest is the proper term in the Anglican Church, the priests of that particular church. There's even a couple of books about them and their profound experiences in the Georgia of the early 1700s. But anyway, that's what the building is famous for, and supposedly a minister of that same church 150 years later, that is in the late 1800s, had died on the night after her wedding, and the priest of the church grieved for her and stayed there for a few years, but then the people began to see her ghost in that graveyard. And what got my interest was there had been several people, it made the Atlanta newspapers, that had come down from Atlanta to St. Simon's Island, which is a kind of resort place, and had seen the ghost in the graveyard. So I conned my friend Jim Mosley and another guy to go down there with me in order to investigate several ghost cases on that island. It's one of those places where there are a lot of ghost cases disproportionate to the area. And I can't report anything special from the other locations, but I remember Jim Mosley saying to me, well, I'm a psychic negative. Anyway, I followed them around the graveyard for a while after he got us in trouble with the police by saying, we're ghost hunters, which you don't do with South Georgia policemen if you really want to. The cop said, oh, it's interesting. We had a Bible salesman here last year, but he got shot looking for ghosts. And I said, Jim, do you know that was what we call here in the South a warning? And we went to see the current priest of the church at his home, and he was clearly not happy to see us there. So we went to the graveyard, and Jim, his expertise being in UFOs and grave robbing in South America, he wrote a book about that. That's him, not me. I've never robbed a grave in my life. But he did point out that the earth in a graveyard has a give to it. And I went around with him and the other guy for a while with my camera ready just in case. And then I thought about his comment about being a psychic negative. So I decided I'm going to go stand at the edge of the graveyard by the side of this church and see what I have to see on my own. And sure enough, at I would say 15 feet above the ground, that's a guess, but it was much higher up than any person could be. In the graveyard was this image of a decomposing woman in Victorian dress. And I snapped a photo, and I think it was a 1-second exposure. I didn't even think it would turn out, but it did. And I had the photo analyzed by Eastman Kodak, who used to, when they were a big company, they used to have a photo analyst in Rochester, New York, their headquarters, and they could not figure out what this thing was, and neither could I on the scene. Many years after that, I had a friend who was an ex-KGB agent. He had been he had worked for Kodak, but anyway, he had access to certain facilities in Russia that were used for photo analysis, mainly for military purposes. And I said, well, can you analyze this thing? It was analyzed many years ago by your former company. So he said, sure. And I think he probably did it by night, but apparently got away with it. And anyway, he said, this is, well, the quotation is on my website. It's really, he concluded that this was clearly a three-dimensional object that was not of the natural persuasion.
And if you go back 30, 40, 50 years, photoshopping things, I think, would be way more difficult than now. And even now, they have, I don't know the exact term, I think it's like deep fake videos. Basically, if you have a 15-second clip of someone's face who's making all sorts of motions, they could use your face and impose, say, President Bush to say whatever you want to say, even in his voice. That technology, I think, now it's even available to consumers, is a very scary thought. And so go back 20 years, to impose something in a picture and make it look realistic was far, far easier than, say, 50 years ago, when you'd have to throw, say, a pan or something in the sky, photograph it, and say, here you go, folks, this is what I captured. And that's why we've come a long way. But that's also the dangers of technology, and also the positive things about technology. You know, who would have thought 30 years ago today everyone would be carrying around a mini computer in their darn pocket? Literally, with everything from just the internet to a phone book to a camera to it being a phone. I don't think anyone could have fathomed that. If you go back to the 80s, the pinnacle of the industrial age, really the end of the industrial age before we became the digital age, I don't think any scientist then would have even imagined what we have today. Let's just say you take an iPhone and you go back to the 60s. People would think you're a time traveler. I mean, well, you'd have to be if you're coming from now, but they would think that this technology is so far advanced that us humans would never have the chance to create it. Yet, here we are. Dr. Greenfield, unfortunately, we've gone over time by 10 minutes, but real quick, before I ask you for your information, let me try to get these questions in, if you can, as quick as possible. One person wants to know about the Skinwalker Ranch, and technically it's helidiumlabs.com. It says, any Skinwalker intelligence? And let me find the other one so we could just sort of merge these together. Okay. He's asking about the Georgia Guidestones and about a nuclear weapon underneath. What do you have to say about that?
Georgia Guidestones are an interesting phenomenon, but they do not have a nuclear weapon buried underneath. They are guidestones, and they were created in modern times, although the person who created them is a shadowy figure, and why they were created, no one seems to know. But it is in the granite capital of the country. The name of the town escapes me. Alberton, Georgia, yeah. So go see them without fear of a nuclear disaster from below. Worry about the nuclear disaster from above.
Yeah,
yes.
Well said.
And so far as Skinwalker Ranch, I think there's a good deal of weird stuff involved there. On the other hand, there is, I believe, it's not a case I've personally investigated, and I tend to fall back on cases that I personally know. And that's not one that I've read about it and I'm well acquainted with it, but I don't have any strong opinions on it. It just, It's one of those cases, and there are lots of them out there, and that sort of is as quick as I can be.
No, I definitely agree with you. And if there wasn't anything to it, why did Robert Bigelow buy it? And then all of a sudden stop talking about it. Anyway, it's been a fantastic time with you, Dr. Greenfield. So fantastic. This flew by. As a matter of fact, that's what the people in the chat are saying. And this is too short, even though we've gone literally over 2 hours since we are over time. Now, I want to give you the moment to plug in your books, website, if there's a way for people to reach you with questions or anything like that. Go for it.
Okay, first of all, disclaimer, everything I do other than my books, which are my, I'm semi-retired, but that's my labor, I do for free. Anything occult, anything UFO-wise, whatever. But my books are, they are commercial ventures, but they are plottingly truthful. And there are two that I will mention. One is The Complete Secret Cipher of the UFOnauts, which, if you read it thoroughly and digest the information, overlaps occultism and UFOs and teaches you how to predict where UFOs will show up next. That is current, and it's available from Paranoia Press and the usual outlets. There are no
Amazon, stuff like that, right?
Amazon and all of the other, Barnes and Noble, and I think they even carry it at Walmart. My current book that I am trying to emphasize is called God Never Does the Same Thing Twice. And it's a gonzo approach to biblical religion, Crowleyan religion, and where the line between reality and unreality come together. I pulled out all the stops on this one. I never stopped and asked myself the question, is this correct or not? It's the second best book I've ever done, and I highly recommend it, and that is available from all of the usual outlets. It comes from Blue Star Press, who has been extremely generous with me and on this particular volume. So buy the books, and if you want to get in touch with me, I do have a Facebook page, Allen Greenfield /author, and if in doubt, just Google my name. I've been on the internet since there's been an internet, so there are hundreds of entries. It's Allen, Allen, Greenfield, like it sounds.
Well said, Dr. Greenfield. Now I'm going to give some shout-outs personally to the people left in chat. We have Aubrey Baldwin, Hadley Scott McIntyre, Lasha Senyak, Lars Saturn, Stacy Singer, Robot. Let's see who else is here. And I'm trying to find another one that has not commented. People that are still in this chat at the moment. A lot of back and forth with amazing comments here too. Let's see who else here is. I mentioned Lasha, of course. I mentioned Lars. I mentioned Hadley Scott McIntyre. Jeremy Karpinski. Thank you, Jeremy, for the first time joining in this chat. And also, let's see here. Give me another name here. I'm just seeing the back and forth and the questions and the comments, which people, like I said, Dr. Greenfield, were very, very engaged because you have so much amazing knowledge to talk about.
I thank you. I hope it's been illuminating.
It has. It absolutely has. MacArthur Louis Saint, I hope I pronounced that properly, MacArthur. Jesse Danner, I want to thank you too. And also we have David Lopez. Thank you, David. Let's see who else. Oh, of course, my moderator and also my social media manager, Pam Brettenberg. She's in the chat as well. And And is there anybody else that I missed that is still here? Because people who are gone I can't see anymore. Okay. Well, I do want to give a big shout out to Third Phase of Moon, who was in here, one of the world's largest UFO YouTube channels. And like I mentioned during the show, they get a lot of footage. And if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't be here today. And if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't be able to do these non-guest videos as well for you folks, for you fine folks. Halidiumlabs.com. Andrew Raz. Let's see who else. And I believe that might be the people left in here. And Craig Herba. Hope I pronounced that properly. Okay. Now, other people I want to thank. Like I said, Third Phase of Moon. Big shout out to you guys. All YouTube Nation, people who are still on and people who have left, I just want to thank you all for being participants in this show. Joe Montaldo, owner of UPRN, United Public Radio Network, which is 107.7 FM. We have to thank him, as well as iHeartMedia and all the terrestrial affiliates and also internet affiliates. Not to mention JC of Deprogrammed Radio. And I did mention Pam Brettenberg, my social media manager. Also, we have Joshua Cheris, who is my assistant producer and VP of operations. If you guys have any guest requests, please email him at drjradioliveguests@gmail.com, which is also written in the chat. I also want to thank, of course, my guest. How can we not thank our guest, Dr. Allen Greenfield? It's been very, very enlightening what you have to say. And even before we got on the show, you told me a lot of great things, so I want to thank you for that. And let's see who else we want to thank here. I do want to thank, I guess, everybody who is participating, but more importantly, folks, it's because of you that the show is going on. It's because of you the channel exists on YouTube. And remember, folks, disclosure is in your hands. Please don't be passive listeners or passive viewers. Take what you see or hear and be proactive. If I stayed passive from 1984 till 2012, well then we would not have nearly as much as information as we do now. As a matter of fact, I don't know if you all know the imposter effect, which means that the more you know, the more you think you know, the less you really start to know, because you start questioning yourself. 1 or 10 questions answered will lead to 10 or 100 more unanswered questions. So again, this is all because of you fine folks. And like I said, disclosure is in your hands. You have to have open minds. Please, folks, take what you heard and do something with it. And other than that, I think we've thanked everybody, and the only thing I have to say is everything about the show is the name of it. Of course, those on YouTube know it's at DRJ Radio Live. Same thing with the website, drjradiolive.com. And everything from Facebook, Minds, Instagram, Twitter, Flickr, Tumblr, you name it, is at DRJ Radio Live. And now, since we are definitely late, beyond late, but it was worth it, I want to thank you all and pay attention for when I give my own NDE, as well as why life flashes before your eyes. And it won't just be a one-way thing. People who are in the chat will absolutely have the opportunity to ask me questions and to give me comments and anything of the sort. So pay attention, folks. It's always there. If you hit the bell on in YouTube at Dr. J Radio Live, then you will get alerts. So with that being said, folks, from the city of demons, or angels, other people call them, this is Dr. J, and I am officially signing off.